I'm glad today to have a chance to speak with Andray Abrahamian. Andray, thanks for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, before we begin, I just want to let everyone know you should have received Andray's bio, but we're glad to have him here at KAI as a non-resident fellow, and he's currently actually in Seoul. So thank you for getting up early this morning to join us, where he's also a visiting scholar at George Mason, Korea.
Yeah, forgive the fact I didn't do the artifice of a suit at 6 in the morning in my spare room, but you guys got a shirt, so I'd be grateful for that.
Completely understandable. If it was 6 a.m. here, I think that I would probably still be half asleep. So, thanks. But speaking of Seoul, maybe before we get into our discussion, I want to just kind of ask, you're living now there. How is the experience of social distancing and living with COVID-19 played out from your perspective and, actually being on the ground there?
I had the misfortune to experience this both in the UK and here. So I got the lockdown experience and the empty shelves and lack of toilet paper experience. And then to come back here and do the quarantine, but see that the world is basically functioning as normal, except with masks and no mass events and hand sanitizer everywhere, provided by every bus stops have hand sanitizer, as do elevators and all companies, was humbling in a way. It's been managed so well here. You may have seen in the news, people are freaking out a little bit about this Itaewon cluster. We're still looking at under 200 cases that have emerged from that cluster. So I consider myself really fortunate to be here.
And I hadn't realized you had been in the UK for this as well. That's really, because I mean, some of the United States have kind of really struggled with handling this in contrast to South Korea.
Yeah, I mean, I think both the US and UK entered a kind of political crisis in the last 4 years, and I don't think it's a coincidence that they've struggled to deal with an actual public health crisis a few years down the line.
Yeah. Well, speaking of public health crises, we recently went through this period of about 3 weeks to where there was heightened speculation about Kim Jong-un. Lots of stories about whether he had a heart procedure gone wrong, whether he was alive or not. All this turned out to basically be wrong. North Korea is a relatively closed society, which makes it difficult to get reliable information. But one of the things that I was really hoping to talk to you about is sort of like how we could do better at this. So, what are some of the sources for information on North Korea and from North Korea that we should really be looking at?
Well, I thought perhaps we could spend a couple of minutes talking about not only the specific sources that we should try to be using to figure out what's going on, but also thinking about how we think about North Korea, and recognizing the limitations that face the news gatherers and reporters, as well as us as audiences. So I think from the big picture, we have to deal with a kind of Orientalism in how we think about the Far East, the Orient. And that's not just North Korea. I'm sure we've all read stories about how Asians follow rules better and accept the government's instructions better in terms of COVID-19, for example. And there's kind of this discourse that the Far East is unknowable and abnormal. And that's compounded by the fact that Pyongyang likes that. Kim Jong-il is said to have told his high-level cadres that Pyongyang has to be kept in a fog. The politics of the country must be kept mysterious. And so they like that. And then I think we have to be aware of the three news cultures that feed us information about North Korea. You've got South Korea, where single source, anonymous source news reporting is very common. and we have to be aware of the limitations that brings. You've got the UK as a major source of news in the English language, and UK news culture operates on kind of a fairness doctrine where it's partisan, but as long as one is being fair, that's considered acceptable news reporting. But when you're dealing with a country like North Korea, which I think we tend to fundamentally view as illegitimate and unfair and unjust, that kind of goes out the window. And then in the US, we have kind of an objectivity doctrine in news. That's like the primary value in news reporting. But that objectivity is much diminished when it comes to international affairs generally and wartime specifically. And there's a number of studies by people like Daniel Hallen or Edward Herman that emphasize that. So that's kind of those are the limitations in the broad sense.
So I'm curious your thoughts, because you said in the U.S. there's this idea of objectivity, and I think in a broad sense you're right. But there's also a lot of new media that's much more partisan. Do you find that they still try to be objective, at least when it comes to something like North Korea, or do you think that that kind of has gone out of the window to an extent with some, we'll say, newer aspects of the U.S. press?
I don't know if that makes a difference. That's not something I've studied specifically, so I guess I'd say these thoughts are tentative, but certainly competition for attention now is fierce, and the business models of both new media and old media that's been challenged by new media are tenuous, and anything you can do to get people on your site is desirable. And North Korea does drive traffic. So that's another issue for both new and old media, is there's such an audience response. Journalists tell me that whatever they write about North Korea will get 3 to 10 times the amount of attention as what they write about South Korea.
Well, even, and I won't say which site, but there was one site that handles essentially foreign policy news that I was reading when Kim Jong-un was missing. And I swear they were posting 3 or 4 new like North Korea things a day, speculating about where he was, what would happen, what would China do, and all of these kinds of things. So there's an extent to where that makes sense from just a content of, all right, touching on the basis, but it seemed to have gone beyond that, that they were trying to drive as many as they could, really.
Right. So again, that's something to be aware of as we try to understand North Korea, as we're a part of these news gathering and then consuming systems that can lead to errors. You asked about the news sources specifically, and as I mentioned, and it's extremely hard to get information out of. They've created, this incredibly robust system of information control. So audiences need to be aware of that single source dynamic that comes from a lot of South Korean mainstream press. But they also need to pay attention, but be aware of the information that comes from defector news sources or on the ground resources like Daily NK or even NK News with on the ground source reporting. Those are limited in scope. Again, we're talking usually about single sources at a single point in time with limited access to information domestically. There's a lot of information that the North Koreans put out themselves in official media. And just in the last few weeks, you're seeing more content by the North Koreans that appears to be kind of video blogging, much more modern than the traditional kind of stoic news reader. It's important to try and triangulate those things as best one can as well.
Well, yeah, and even under Kim Jong-un, there seems to be a slight more tolerance or desire to actually be to acknowledge certain realities that are taking place. He's much more critical at times of, like for last year, I think it was the education system, that has come out. They've acknowledged some test failures. So even just in the change in leadership, you've seen some perhaps slight nuance changes in the content they allow out.
Yeah, I think that's true. And with the video blogging and a slightly increased presence on Twitter, you're seeing them experiment with the forms of communication as well, targeting outsiders and trying to adjust to the taste of the 21st century. They're still behind the curve pretty significantly, but yeah, it's still, with such a black box, you have to try and have as wide a range of information as possible. So as we're looking at the COVID-19 story, for example, I think Daily NK, very valuable, as is NK News, as is, official pronouncements by the WHO, as well as paying attention to the aid community and the kind of statements that are coming out from NGOs, who often have people on the ground, but don't at this period generally because of the North Korean lockdown. And so, but then when we're talking about a general news consuming audience, that's a big ask. To try to understand this country, possibly we're asking you to look at a bunch of specialty news, really niche types of information, be aware of media theory and all sorts of other things. It's a lot to ask. There's a big world. There's a lot going on. It's not easy.
Well, it may be challenging for the general consumer, but how do mainstream media try to filter the sources that they have? I mean, clearly Twitter and social media aren't designed to do that, but what kind of tools do the mainstream press do to try and realize, is this one source story maybe legitimate, or is this something that is just fantical and that we should just let sort of go?
I'm glad you asked, because I wrote an article for your blog a few weeks ago, which I think highlights an important concept originally promulgated by a media scholar called Jeremy Tunstall. And he describes a concept called competitor colleagues. So in news media, particularly in specialist news, which being a Korea correspondent is, there's kind of a social dynamic wherein people are helping each other, even though they're competing organizations. I think journalists here often help each other try to parse these bits of information as they come out. They're often checking in, being like, does this make sense? Or who's this coming from? Or do you have anyone corroborating this? And there's sort of a filter. And I think that dynamic was happening as rumors emerged about Kim Jong-un's health. But once CNN ran a very, very dramatic headline, also anonymously sourced from someone in DC, the story just became so massive, and that dynamic where every news organization had to respond and had to get the traffic, that kicked in and just overwhelmed that social system, that competitor colleague kind of self-regulating system. So for I think us, it was kind of fun. It was 2 weeks where you weren't thinking about COVID-19 constantly, so that was a nice respite. But was led to that bonkers couple of weeks.
So even if you have information, you've talked about how it's hard to know if it's trustworthy. I often look at trade data to try and understand what's going on in the economy, but countries, they misclassify data from time to time. You have China, to where it hasn't included its crude oil exports to North Korea since 2013. What are some of the steps we can do to determine how valid the information is, and how do we utilize, or how do you try to utilize what is probably imperfect data about North Korea?
when it comes to the economy, there again, I think you have to employ that principle of triangulating as much as possible. So looking at what the North Koreans put out about budget, for example, or statements that they make about the economy in the media, looking at what frequent visitors to the country, particularly an organization I used to be involved with, Joseon Exchange, and what their observations are, as well as defector media and defector reports. And then, of course, trade data from partners of North Korea, particularly China. You have to try and piece all that together. But trade data from China, that's limited as well for a number of reasons. So, what do you suppose those limitations are, Troy?
So, I mean, first off, like I mentioned, we know there's certain things that, like the crude oil, that just aren't getting put in there. You have questions about, are certain items not being classified that perhaps we know are transiting the border? Now, they're maybe not being classified because they're being smuggled or because, they're officially going through. I've talked with one researcher who spent 3 or so months, I think, on the border, if I remember correctly, and talked about how China essentially, when they want to loosen sanctions, will put in the customs people who they know have the connections to the North Koreans and will allow things to pass. When they feel the need to pressure the North Koreans, we'll switch those out with people who don't have those connections and so therefore won't let things pass. And so that there's a bit of a game that goes on the border to an extent. I think, the challenges is that, it's the data we have, so it's the data we have to analyze. I would say it's probably to an extent, fairly accurate, with the caveats that, there are things such as crude oil, which are not in there. There are some items which, if you look at it, might perplex you, such as some trade in iron ore, but it's because it's of a classification that the Chinese argue isn't actually covered by the North Korean sanctions, or the sanctions on North Korea. So you have these weird quirks in there where you'll see things and you'll look at it, you'll be like, wait, why is that there? But to me, the great Pandora's or black box, which Daily NK had something on this recently, was, we have this trade data, and my question would be, looking at UN sanctions, how does North Korea pay for all of this? Because there's not supposed to be correspondent accounts anymore. You're not supposed to use bulk cash. And there was a story in Daily NK suggesting that when/if, because there's some indications maybe some of the trade has started back up, that goods are actually bartered, that there are certain North Korean items that are provided to China in exchange for certain items in China. So hence you get around the financial sanctions by engaging probably in barter rather than, cash actually, being exchanged.
Right, because it seems like they're running a deficit as well. So, how is that balancing out over the long term?
Well, I mean, even if we assume it's all on cash basis, so I don't remember the exact numbers, but there's a paper I'm working on to where if you go back to about a year or two ago and you look at like when, in theory, a lot of the overseas laborers were still in China and Russia, not getting into the question of how many maybe are still there, but when they were still there in a large number. When you add that in, you add in a few other things like some rough estimates on smuggling and everything, you can kind of fairly quickly cover about half the trade deficit they have, if not more. So there's ways to see it functioning. I don't know if you can cover everything, but you have these challenges. And then speaking of data and how much you can trust it, for me, one of the things that I think is the most difficult data sets to look at is the cryptocurrency stuff, because you'll see these, they've stolen X dollars, which is somewhat, to me, doesn't really make sense, because one, cryptocurrency is highly volatile in the value. While there have been some documented cases that the UN has shown to where they withdrew the money from the exchanges, there's also cases I've seen to where it's clear that they haven't. So, what North Korea has in terms of cryptocurrency literally changes by the day. And I have the chart accessible right now, but I kind of compared it to the S&P since you got the lockdowns in the US. And you would have been better off having your money in the US stock market than in cryptocurrency when I looked at it a couple of weeks ago. So even there, it's hard to tell how, other than it's a way, it's pseudonymous, not anonymous. So once you start knowing who has which accounts, you can start tracking things. So there's limits to what they can use and how. I'm not saying it's not useful to them, but I feel like sometimes we have an overly simplistic view of North Korea and cryptocurrency.
Yeah, that's not an issue I've thought that much about, actually. It probably bears a bit more attention paid to it. But it speaks to the fact that there are always these gaps, right? And as best you try to inform yourself as an expert about North Korea, the gaps end up often being filled by intuition, or informed intuition, perhaps you can say. But that leaves so much room for any individual analyst's interpretations to fill those gaps, which is, again, as a general news reader or consumer of information about North Korea, you have to be aware of who is who in this field too, right? Because the kinds of quotations they're giving journalists, or the kinds of op-eds that they or we are penning, are informed by these gaps that we're filling in with our own biases and interactions as well. So that goes back kind of to our original question, where there's this whole other layer, and it's a topic that inspires such intensity of emotion. It's not one of these issues where there's a lot of balance, right? I think along with Iran and Cuba, there's, in especially US foreign policy circles, it's really emotion driven in a lot of ways. It's really kind of irrational.
You mentioned this idea of that a lot of it is interpretation, and we did an event with Marcus Nolan years and years ago, and one of the things he said at that event was that and he was quoting, I think, if I remember correctly, Walter Mondale, that anyone who says they're a North Korea expert either is lying or doesn't know what they're talking about, because there is no such thing. And part of it is because we do have to fill these gaps to where we can't necessarily always make good analysis. And one thing, you talked about triangulating data, looking at other things. There's this whole question of have sanctions really been effective on pressuring North Korea? And I'll see some commentators, and they'll point to the trade data and say, well, look, there's been a significant decline in trade between China and North Korea. Yes, maybe they're surviving off reserves, but this can't be sustained. Then I look at this and I say, okay, that's true and everything, but there's also these other things like smuggling we know about. So, even if they're in a deficit, it's not as big a deficit as we think. And then if you start looking at things like the daily Nikkei market price data and other things, you start asking questions of like, well, if I compare this to Iran, where we also have sanctions, why are we not seeing the same kinds of effects in the economy? And so, even if sanctions are having an effect, I think it's much less of an effect than it is in Iran or other countries. And so, both of those you can make are a valid interpretation, but we're all kind of trying to divine what's really happening there.
Yeah, and when it comes to that sanctions issue, because of how we see on the ground relative to other sanctions target states, that's where I think a lot of analysts' intuitions and emotional thinking fills in those gaps in particular. And you do have kind of a cap that's like, if we push a little harder, maybe we'll get here. And then there's the, whatever we do, we're just going to make ordinary people suffer and not get to our policy goals in the end. And I think I'm more towards the latter. But yeah, that's one of several emotional issues I guess we deal with.
So I want to turn to a couple questions we have from the audience. One you touched on briefly, but so one attendee has asked, what is your view of the implications of North Korea's latest use of YouTube to deliver its messages to the outside world, including Echo DPRK?
The implications of it. I guess it's too soon to tell. Oof, that's a good cop out of an answer. Apologies to whoever asked that. I mean, I think it shows that over the past decade, I think more people than ever from middle and upper middle classes have had access to certainly China, either by traveling there directly or having friends or family members who have gone back and forth on business or for whatever reason. And so there's a growing awareness that how they communicate is generally antiquated. And so I think probably it represents the way a new idea circulates around, these upper middle class circles, where eventually enough people say we should try to do things a little bit differently, that people who are actual decision makers kind of get the message. I think that happens not only with how they communicate with the outside world, but also with other policies as well. And I think we saw it with how they run their economy for several years, from say 2010 to 15, 16 or so, where new ideas were kind of percolating and circulating around this social class. How far they will take it and how much they'll invest in this kind of communication, we have yet to see. I think I'll be really interested to see if some of these ways of communicating then become adopted for the domestic audience a little bit more as well.
So also have a question from Hee-Jung Yang at RFA. What would be the implications of North Korea's, once again, YouTube and Twitter, to deliver responses to Western media reporting on North Korea? A young lady interviewed by these channels claimed to be an ordinary shopper at Kongbuk supermarket and said that there were lots of commodities available in the market, contrary to Western media reports that hoarding was taking place in North Korea. And the YouTube video was posted around the time these rumors around Kim Jong-un's health were swirling, which, this isn't in the question, but the North Koreans basically didn't even acknowledge at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So, maybe as a tool to respond to what's in our media.
Yeah, that was interesting because of how quickly they did respond to the rumors of panic buying, at least at kind of elite shopping centers. Yeah, what to make of it? I mean, I don't know. It's a single video in a single shop, so you can add that to the basket of
single sources.
Information. Yeah. So yeah, limited what you can conclude from it.
Yeah, I think this is one of the challenges. We even just looking at Kim Jong-un, there's a lot of this sort of like analysis by TV of his health, and I remember thinking to myself when he had disappeared that one of the challenges with this is that if he comes out on crutches, I mean, for all we know, he had ankle surgery, he had knee replacement surgery, and even all those two, we may not know which one specifically it is and everything. So I think there are challenges. Clearly we can see that he's obese, but sort of getting beyond sort of those things, and even if you think about a lot of people in the United States who are obese, or even professional athletes, who are much huskier and like linemen in the NFL, just because you are obese does not mean that you're going to keel over at the age of 30 something. So I think there are real challenges information wise.
Yeah, and I mean he showed up May 1st. That was what, 19 days ago here. So is that longer? He's been gone again longer. So potentially we're just one single source leak away from this happening again. Although perhaps there would be more pushback from that kind of competitor, colleague, expert journalist community. I think the appetite for going through another 2 weeks of intense manic speculation is probably reduced. I hope so. I got other things to do.
I think we probably all do. But before I let you go, there's one last question from Flora Greco. What can we expect for inter-Korean relations after Moon's landslide victory in April?
Yeah, oh, that's a great question to end on. Because it also speaks to the COVID-19 situation in North Korea, where you would expect Kim Jong-un and his team to want to explore whether or not now Moon feels a little braver about inter-Korean cooperation or types of cooperation that the United States might disapprove of, because of how strong his mandate now appears generally, and the fact that the US is distracted, and that the talks over cost sharing of US troops in South Korea are at a standstill. If that is, the North Koreans are really doing as well with COVID-19 as they say they are, because then on that issue, I think both Koreas could come together from a position of confidence and say, hey, you've coped with this issue, we've coped with it. You know, what are some things we could cooperate on? Possibly research or production of masks or something like that. I think the COVID-19 crisis possibly provides a bit of an opportunity. That said, if you look at inter-Korean relations and North Korea-US relations as part of a process that is currently paused following the collapse of Hanoi and the stalled out stuff from last fall, North Korea will be very keen not to re-engage from a position of weakness. And so if they are less confident about how their economy is going, or indeed there are problems with the coronavirus that we don't yet know about, you know, that could act as a further limitation on prospects for inter-Korean relations warming up. So again, we don't know. We have to be aware of the range of possibilities and be prepared for more than one potential outcome, which I suppose is as good a way as any of saying we don't know.
Well, it's a more diplomatic way of saying, you know, we don't know.
Yeah.
With that, Andray, thank you very much for taking the time and getting up early again to come on with us today. I appreciate that. And before I go, I just want to let everybody know we have two upcoming webinars. One on Thursday morning. It's our look at the KBO starting up its season and moving on to ESPN. And if you haven't seen, we're fortunate we have, for example, Eric Hacker, who's going to be one of our guests, who played both in the major leagues here in the United States and in the KBO. We also are fortunate to have a wide range of experts as well to talk with him about this. And also on May 26th, we'll be looking at the future for Korea-Japan relations with a conversation with Alexa Stutton. With that, thank you, Andray, again, and have a great day.
Thanks.